All right. So we are ready to go, and I'm just going to have Kevin John and Samuel Allen go ahead and jump in and introduce themselves.
Okay, thank you for inviting us here today. We're kind of excited to share a topic that's pretty near and dear to internal audit's heart, and that is internal controls. So before we jump right into internal controls, I'd like to do a few brief introductions so you kind of know who we are, maybe why we were invited to speak on this topic, and then we can get into the meatier subject. So for starters, my name is Kevin John. I'm the Deputy Audit Executive for the Internal Audit Department of the State Board of Education. I've been here almost 9 years, so over 8 years and counting. It's been an amazing ride so far. So prior to being in internal audit, I was actually the director of the Utah Center for Assistive Technology, which currently operates within the State Office of Rehab right now. And then prior to that, I was a risk manager for ARS. My undergrad studies and emphasis was in criminal law. I have an MBA and I'm a certified fraud examiner. So with me today, I brought Samuel Allen. Samuel Allen is one of our senior education auditors at the Internal Audit Department at USB as well. He's been with Internal Audit for approximately 5 years. We were fortunate enough to pick up Samuel as he was finishing his master's of public administration at BYU. So we were excited to grab him. He's got a unique background as well. His undergrad emphasis, I believe, was in ethics, and Samuel is one of our certified internal auditors with the Institute of Internal Auditors. So we appreciate him joining us here. So as auditors, we've spent many years studying internal control concepts, design, implementing internal controls within our own department, or helping others in their agencies as well design and implement internal controls. Obviously, as auditors, we spend a lot of time testing internal controls for operational effectiveness as well. So we are excited to provide a high-level overview of internal controls today. Unfortunately, this is a subject I think we could talk days about, let alone an hour. And so it is going to be a relatively high-level overview of internal controls. Hopefully, that it's more of a review for most of you, that you're already proficient in internal controls. But if not, maybe you'll get some tools here that and hopefully will encourage some interest and you can dig in a little bit deeper. So a little bit more about our actual department. The internal audit department at USB is made up of 8 individuals, all of which have many diverse backgrounds. So we have Juris Doctorates and CPAs, like I said, CIAs and CFEs, MBAs and MPAs, MAAs, whatever. We've got the alphabet soup that you would typically see in an education office. Our chief audit executive is Debbie Davis. So she was not able to participate today, so we're sorry about that. But if you get an opportunity to meet Debbie, she's fabulous. There's a possibility she might poke her head in just to say hi. We'll see. So within internal audit, we provide 5 critical functions to the USB. So first and foremost, we perform internal audits. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. However, we do perform those audits consistent with the standards promulgated by the Institute of Internal Auditors. So we are required to follow standards by the Utah Internal Audit Act. The USB is required to maintain an internal audit shop consistent with the Utah Internal Audit Act, and we are that shop. We are the only audit shop at the State Board of Education. I know LEAs, a lot of times we hear it a lot of times when we go out, oh, we just got done being audited by someone else at USB. So there's a lot of monitors at USB who do a lot of monitoring to provide services to LEAs, but we are the only internal audit shop actually at USB. So our second service that we provide, critical function, is consultation services. So this is typically viewed as technical assistance. This presentation is a great example of what that may look like. Third, we do operate the public education hotline. So if I know LEAs are required per RT 77113 to maintain their own hotline, but there is an opportunity to just forward those to us. If it does get forwarded to USB, it would be our department that takes that phone call. So fourth, we are the external audit liaison between USB and all external audit shops. So it would be no different than hiring an audit or an attorney to speak to opposing counsel. The USB kind of views it the same way. We use auditors to facilitate communication to ensure sound understanding with other outside auditors. This helps us mitigate findings at the USB and expedite resolutions with other auditors. So So that's kind of the fourth critical function we offer. And in case you were wondering, USB gets audited an awful lot. So we stay busy doing that. And then our fifth critical function that we do is we do perform an annual risk assessment. So we mentioned that we do internal audits. Those are based on risk. We do an annual risk assessment. And then the board has the ultimate say on what audits are prioritized and selected. So as the internal audit shop, we don't just get to audit whatever we'd like. We do have to present an annual risk assessment to the board's designated audit committee. And then whatever recommendations come out of the audit committee are voted upon by the full board. And that determines our audit plan for the year.
Hey, so why are we talking about internal controls today? Why is it important to have them? First, state and federal regulations, as well as Board Rule R277-113, requires to have an effective internal control system. Receiving federal funds is actually contingent on having an internal control system that can reasonably ensure compliance with the award requirements. If controls are weak or non-existent, it doesn't mean that funds are automatically forfeit, but it could complicate things, particularly if an audit reveals improper use of funds. When I was a new auditor introducing control systems to our clients, we would talk about them as an intersection. For most places, a red street light will be sufficient. In the biggest cities, we might even see some crossing guards. And yet in the smallest cities, towns, or I really should say neighborhoods, maybe all that is needed is a dirt path and still no one would get in an accident. While the degree of an internal control system may change, the requirements to have one remains, and each system should be tailored to meet its need. So why would regulators require an internal control system? We'll discuss this further, but internal controls help with efficiency and effectiveness. With new legislation being passed every year, changes in technology like the introduction of AI and more, it can be challenging to keep up with everything that's required of us to not only run programs, but also safeguard against risks. Designing a system of internal controls can preemptively mitigate unforeseen risks and provide a level of trust that we will reach our goals. Regulators want to know that they can trust us to respond to changes and ensure that when they provide funds, the funds are used for the purpose they were awarded for.
Okay, another reason why internal controls is important is to mitigate fraud. Why do I say mitigate, right? It's a great question because the reality is, it's unfortunate reality too, that it would be nearly impossible to eliminate fraud, right? Fraud is just all around us. So we talk about mitigation, and good internal controls can help us do that, right? Essentially, they're there in place to make sure we don't end up on the 5 o'clock news, right? 6 o'clock news where, oh no, this LEA, lost all this money. So we're really, one of the driving factors of internal controls is to mitigate fraud. So let me share a few statistics that I found with you that will hopefully drive home this reality of fraud. So most of the statistics I'm going to share today, and we're going to share throughout this presentation, come from the ACFEs, which is the Association for Certified Fraud Examiners biannual report. They issue a report, and it's called the Occupational Fraud Report, report to the nations. And anyone can go out there and take a look at it. It's available to the public. If you're a member, there's some other resources that are available. But let's look at a few of the things that they've reported in 2022. So first and foremost, as I'm sure everyone's aware, fraud impacts all industries. So here's some industries that reported, and I should say that the annual report is a survey that's conducted to certified fraud examiners where we can report up fraud that was identified throughout the years. And so this is what I was seeing. So the numbers are not necessarily representative of which industries have the most fraud. In a lot of cases, some industries just employ a higher number of certified fraud examiners, or they have fraud investigative teams. And so they're going to report more cases or potentially find more cases. That's not to say that they necessarily have more cases. So we'll take that, please take that in context as we share some of this information. But the survey did report, if you look in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, that the government or public sector wasn't immune from fraud, right? In 2022, they reported 198 cases, and the median loss was $150,000. That's a pretty significant amount of money. If you look top line closer to the center, For those who specifically identified their industry as education, we can see that there were 69 cases reported and the median loss was $56,000. So pretty substantial still. Now, when you look at fraud across different levels of government, and you look at those victims specifically, we can see that the national level incurred the greatest number of frauds and the highest dollar amount, right? Roughly 46% of that government public sector was the national level, with an average of $200,000 per loss. That's significant, right? However, it may be more significant at the local level. Even though it's a smaller percentage and a smaller dollar amount, there's also so many fewer dollars to go around at the local level that to lose $125,000 on average is substantial, right, to say the least. So just again, just a reminder that fraud's everywhere. It's happening everywhere. Another interesting thing is, how is fraud being perpetuated, right? So I pulled down this table and you can see second line down, government and public administration, and a little bit further down we have towards the bottom, we have education. And you can start to see areas where fraud's happening, right? So some of the higher areas in government and education in general is non-cash. That makes a lot of sense given there's not a lot of cash necessarily floating around education, that's similar to something you might see like retail, right? That has a lot higher percentage, 24%. The other one that's really high in the government and education sector is billing. This makes more sense, right? Since we are doing a lot of some procurement, billing, things of that nature. I think one of the more interesting things too, for me too, is that corruption was the highest area amongst all areas in all industries, right? To me, that's pretty scary, right? When we talk about corruption, we're talking about bribery and double billing and things like that. It's harder to catch. So it is kind of a gloomy outlook, is that fraud's maybe getting a little bit more complicated. One other thought before we move on and talk about other reasons is I often hear that fraud is most prevalent amongst those with lower education, and for that reason we don't have to worry about it in education. We've got a lot of people who are educated and therefore aren't going to commit fraud, and it's actually quite the opposite. So in 2022, 65% of all fraud reported in the survey was done by those with the university degree. That's pretty telling, right? So an interesting statistic. However, I do have some good news. It's not all doom and gloom, right? That between 2012 and 2022, fraud cases are being caught faster, therefore leading to smaller losses. And this in part is because of the fact that people are taking internal controls more seriously.
There are many more reasons to establish a strong internal control system, and honestly, more exciting reasons than just to comply with regulators or prevent fraud. Internal control systems help us reach our objective, the objective that we get to set for ourselves. This is the most important reason for having internal controls. It's to increase the odds of achieving our objective. If we can't meet our objectives, we're bound to fail. A system of internal controls is that structure needed to make sure that people get to the right place at the right time and that they arrive safely. Notice that this book reads controls designed, whereas the hand shows and implemented. Policies that are stored in a file cabinet and not reviewed or used would be like taking this hand away. If enough things fall through the crack, we won't be able to reach our objective. But what if our internal control system is not as robust as it could be? Like, instead of a nice leather-bound book, we only have some free-floating pages of policy to rely on. It's possible we can still reach our goal, but maybe we won't. And that's why a framework is first developed. We first address the most important risks and work our way down. Okay, so here's an analogy of why implementing a system of controls is so important. If you've ever watched Olympic archery, you know how accurate people can be. There's only one gold medal awarded at the end, though. The person who wins gold aims for the center of the target, but so does the person who wins silver and the person who wins bronze. The deciding factor of who wins and doesn't is not determined at the day of the event, but is rather determined by the years of practice leading up to the event. Said another way, we do not rise to the level of our goals, but we fall to the level of our systems. I'm going to repeat it one more time because it's so vital. We do not rise to the level of our goals, but we fall to the level of our systems. If you only take one thing home today, this statement should be it. A few years back, I ran a marathon, and one sign that I passed by a spectator read, "How do you complete a marathon? By taking one step and then another." That system of taking the next step forward is all there is to a marathon, but based on training, nutrition, and so on, some people obviously finish much faster than others. I was one of the slow ones for sure. So if we want to make serious progress, if we really want to achieve our goals and objectives, we need to first focus on the system, and then the goals and objectives will follow after.
All right, so we've talked a little bit about why. Now let's talk about the how. And I think this is exactly why everyone kind of came. Let's talk about those, the internal control components. But one of the things before we maybe jump into those 5 components is understanding a little bit about where internal controls came from and some of the fundamentals, and that'll give us a good foundation to help us understand those 5 components. So first, there's 2 primary sources to get internal control information. The first one is COSO. Hopefully you've heard of it. It's the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations. They were kind of this joint initiative clear back in the early 90s, made up of these 5 professional organizations, and they were dedicated to helping organizations improve their performance, right? So they kind of created this foundation wherein everything else was built. They updated their framework in 2013, and they continue to monitor and provide resources for people like you and I to do. The other is the Green Book. So the Green Book is essentially the government's adaptation of COSO's framework, right? So back in 2013, the Green Book was originally written for the federal government, but now state, local governments, anyone can take that Green Book and they can apply it to themselves. It's really just kind of I like to call it a dumbed down version, if you will. So we threw up the link there. You can easily find it just by Googling Green Book. It's a free available resource online. Maybe Samuel can drop the link in the chat as well. And that way, if you guys want to go out and take a look at it, you can. It's like, I think it's 86 pages, 84, 86 pages. So it's a quick read, but it's definitely an asset for those who want to learn more about the Green Book. So our presentation today is going to be based on the Green Book and internal audits experience, both adapting and testing control environments based on the principles and attributes that are found in the Green Book. So now, as far as fundamentals go for internal control, so there's a couple things I just want to lay the groundwork for so we understand exactly what we're talking about. One, internal control is a process, right? It's a process that is implemented or affected by the oversight body, management, personnel. What internal controls do is they provide a reasonable level of assurance that objectives of the entity are going to be achieved, right? So it's reasonable. It's not an absolute guarantee. That's something to keep in mind. Because internal controls is a management function, then resources like COSO and the Green Book are typically going to be discussed in the context of management within the entity. So if you're an auditor like myself or Samuel, you're going to have to look at it through a slightly different lens, but great. I mean, it's a great resource. It's there. The Green Book is going to talk a lot about, and internal controls in general are going to talk about different roles and responsibilities on internal controls, specifically the oversight body. And the oversight body typically has the responsibility for overseeing like strategic direction of the entity, right? Think your board. That's typically who we would see in an oversight body. It could be made up of senior management as well. Then your second level is going to be management, right? These are the people who are directly responsible for all the activities of the entity, including designing and implementing your internal control system. And then that third group is going to be personnel. And why do I say personnel in general? Because personnel help management design, implement, make sure the systems operate effectively. And then where I see personnel come in the most, I think in a lot of cases, is then reporting out issues as they happen, right? So again, what I'm trying to touch here is people are what make internal controls work. So although management's going to be responsible for these internal control systems in general, they're going to rely on personnel to implement them, to see the issues, whatever. So it's important that we get buy-in at all levels within our entity to make sure our internal controls work. Otherwise, they're doomed to fail. And so that's why on the slide we say you, like it takes everyone to make sure the internal controls are going to work. Next, you've probably seen it. Hopefully you've all seen it. The COSO model and the Green Book both use the cube to visualize three different things. One, the objectives. So across the top, we see those objectives. We have operations, reporting, and compliance. Well, operations, we're talking about the effectiveness and efficiency of your operations. When we talk about reporting, we talk about reliability in reporting. When you're issuing reports, can they be relied on, right? And then compliance. As government entities or entities within government, right? We have a lot of compliance objectives. And so the purpose of internal controls is to make sure that we comply with applicable laws and regulations. There are the 5 components: control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information, communication, and monitoring. We're going to dive into those. And then across the side, we can see the different levels of each entity. And so as we start talking about internal controls, or as you dive into internal controls, it's important to remember that when we're talking about internal controls, there's typically controls at all levels within the entity. And so for some reason it froze. I don't know why it stopped there. Okay, there we go. So we use one example like dual language immersion, right? And there could be controls at the program level, the department level, the entity level, whatever, right? And so it says function, unit, division, entity, whatever they're called in your unit. So again, controls cover the gap, they cover the expansiveness of your organization, right? So each component is going to be made up of principles and attributes. We're going to jump into those. Another fundamental thing to remember is internal control is the first line of defense. It's not the only line of defense, right? So there are other lines of defense. Internal audit's one of them. It could be part of your internal control system. You could see it that way, or you could view it as something slightly different. So another fundamental concept is internal control is not a single event. It's a series of actions that are going to occur throughout the operation of your organization. I remember an audit that we did, it was a couple of years ago, and we showed up to an LEA and we asked them for a policy and procedure, and they opened up their drawer and they handed me their policy and procedure, and they're like, yep, here's our policy on that. And it was hilarious to me because that policy and procedure had another LEA's name in it. And so clearly that LEA had adopted a policy from another LEA and not even taken the time to update the name to reflect the actual organization. So this brings me to another fundamental, and that's every organization's different. And because every organization is different, every organization's internal control system is also going to be different. So adopting model policies, though it may be a good way to start, it's usually not a good place to end. We have to modify our control activities, our internal control systems, so that they match our environments, they match our strategic plans, our entity sizes, whatever, right? So there is some judgment there when we establish internal controls. 2 last thoughts, and then I'll switch to a slightly different concept. But one, if we elect to outsource operational processes to another entity, a third party, if you will, it is our responsibility to understand their internal control system, so we know how it impacts our internal control system, right? So in a lot of cases we see, especially maybe in charter schools, where we may outsource something like accounting or payroll, right? It's then our responsibility to understand their internal control system and how that impacts ours, so that we make sure that we are meeting our operational requirements, our reporting requirements, our compliance requirements, things of that nature. And then last thought there, external auditors, right? External auditors, it probably goes without saying, but just make sure, again, as we're saying this foundation, they are not part of an entity's internal control system. So while management may use, say, external audit reports to incorporate recommendations from external auditors to make your internal control system more robust, it's not actually part of your internal control system. Okay, so changing gears slightly, and then I'm going to turn this over to Samuel. One of the other fundamental things that we hear all the time, or we get to talk about all the time, sorry, I'm going to go back there, is documentation. So documentation is an absolute necessary part of your internal control system. right? Obviously, the level and nature of documentation is going to vary based on the size, complexity of your organization, but it's absolutely vital that we're documenting, right? So I love this little slide, this comic strip. Does anyone know where we keep the unwritten rules, right? Far too often we show up to LEAs and they're like, oh, we're supposed to do this or we're supposed to do this. And the reality is it's not written down. So it's hard to hold people accountable to things that's not being done, right? So just keep in mind, as we develop our internal control systems and they become more robust, we should be documenting things. One of the things that we should be documenting on our internal control system is if we choose not to implement a principle or an attribute of internal controls, we should document why. So when auditors come out and say, hey, you know, what are we doing in this area? You're like, oh, we've elected not to do that. And here's our justification. Here's the rationale of how we arrived at the conclusion that we're not going to implement that principle or whatever. And then great, then the auditors can say it. And it's like, oh, it looks like they've assumed that risk or they've made a decision. So the Green Book does lay out documentation requirements. And so that's something, if you're interested a little bit more as far as what documentation looks like, you could go out to that Green Book and look. I think they have an appendix specifically that kind of drives it home. So.
Okay, control environment. This is the first component of a successful internal control framework. And it's really where the organization will outline its high-level objectives. For us, we're here to educate students, not sell scooters. The control environment will determine how the organization defines its objectives and organizes its control activities. The control environment outlines the responsibilities of the governing board and management. For us, this is probably a review, but things like creating an org chart and establishing a code of conduct is standard practice. You may be surprised, however, to hear that doesn't always happen. During our audits, we've heard that LEA personnel didn't even know what an org chart was, that employee KSAs and job responsibilities are not documented because the industry frequently changes, or that metadata dictionaries are not always formalized because new tables and columns are added so quickly that definitions become outdated, to which we think all the more reason to document them. It's rare to come across an organization that understands the value of strong policies and procedures more than it simply relies on competent individuals. But individuals are important. The Green Book specifically states that control environment includes a commitment to recruit, develop, and retain competent individuals. This is even more important when the organization is smaller because they can't always afford the costs associated with hiring and rehiring and retraining for the same position every year. Control environment also includes the accountability and evaluation structure for an entity to achieve its objectives by holding its people accountable. The governing body and management share responsibility to establish ethical values and integrity. The culture exists, you know, be it what it may. But who is creating that culture, and is it created with intention? What is being specifically done to ensure the culture is positive? As noted in the Green Book, tone at the top can be either a driver or a barrier to internal control. Some frequent questions we ask here are things like, how do employees know what's expected of them? Do we tolerate non-compliance with agency policies? Do we expect employees to work long hours or not even report all the hours worked? There are lots of places these types of questions can lead, but the important part is to be intentional about the culture we set. Now, in an ideal environment, we'd expect to see that the governing body is creating a strategic plan with a mission, vision, and then that plan cascades down to each individual employee so they can see how their specific actions contribute to the plan as a whole. As stated in the Green Book, as part of establishing an organizational structure, management considers how units interact in order to fulfill their overall responsibilities. Management establishes reporting lines within an organizational structure so that the units can communicate the quality information needed for each unit to fulfill its overall responsibilities. Green Book continues, management considers the overall responsibilities assigned to each unit, determines what key roles are needed to fulfill the assigned responsibilities, and establishes the key roles. Those in key roles can then, of course, further assign responsibilities for internal controls and roles below them in the organizational structure. But as Kevin mentioned, they ultimately retain ownership for fulfilling the overall responsibilities assigned to the unit. Okay, so taking all that into consideration, when we ask people what they're doing for education or what responsibilities they have, we're actually asking about their role in the internal control framework. So in some ways, if we ask a section accountant what they do, and their answer is is likely limited to their day-to-day activities like purchasing supplies, authorizing travel, that sort of things. But it's actually part of a broader picture to help educate and prepare students for the future. We should be able to make those connections. In this first component of control environment, when we help employees see themselves in that overall vision of the organization and how they fit into the internal control framework.
All right. So with our internal control foundation established, right, we've got roles and responsibilities. We've identified our objectives. We've established a tone at the top, those things within those principles within control environment. We're ready to move on to the next step. And the next step is risk assessment process. So in that risk assessment process, there's a few things we're trying to accomplish, right? So first, what we need to do is we need to define our objectives that were previously identified. So in step one, we identified our objective, right? In education, it might be to educate students. If you're the Razor company, it might be to sell scooters, or if you're Starbucks, it's to make the best cup of coffee. But it's like, what are your objectives? Once you've identified those in that step one, then step two in this risk assessment, we need to define those objectives. So what does it mean to define an objective, right? So management should define objectives in specific terms. So they're understood by all people within the entity, all personnel, right? So when I think of defining it personally, I think of things like, well, what is to be achieved? Who's going to achieve it? Maybe how will it be achieved? Timeframes for achievement, things of that nature. It's like very explicit on what is this objective and what are we trying to get at? If we use Samuel's earlier example of the archery target, right, the goal was, well, I'm going to hit the bullseye every single time, right? And so you're defining it that way. So some of these things may already be defined for us when we're talking about compliance objectives, right? We live in the world of government. In a lot of cases, our objectives are handed to us, right? The legislature's meeting right now, and who knows what bills are going to come down from the legislature that then tells us, oh, and by the way, you have to prepare this report every year. You have to do whatever. So a lot of those are going to be partially defined or maybe even fully defined for us. But there are certainly other cases where we're going to have the liberty to define our objectives as we see fit. So there's several ways you could define objectives, right? Of course, there's a quantitative objective where performance measures could be a numerical value, right? Think ratios, percentages, that type of stuff. But there's also qualitative objectives. And I think this applies in a lot of cases to education, where we have more like milestones, right? And less a percentage, a degree of performance, if you will. So again, we're defining that objective, and we're either doing it in quantitative or qualitative ways so that people can really understand it. In a governmental entity, like we said, not always the case, because we have legislators or regulators who are going to tell us what it is, but it's good to go. So let's use an example to kind of bring this home, and I'm going to make it a simple example. Maybe overly simple, but let's use graduation as an example, right? So our objective is to graduate students, right? And so what is that? How do we define that? How do we define that objective? Well, the state has already come in and defined some of that for us and said, well, you have to get 24 credits. I believe it's still 24 credits. And there are some opportunities to potentially redefine that and add some additional credits, but at the bare minimum, you have to get 24 credits. But then they left some room for other means to define that, right? So you may define it and say, and we're going to establish a goal or an objective to graduate 95% of all of our students. So this is kind of roughly what we're doing, right? We're defining what does it look like to graduate, what percentage, what timeline, right? We want to get them all graduated by the 12th grade. So that's within maybe K to 12, 13 years, whatever. So we're defining that objective. So with our objective defined, we're now in a position to start to identify risk tolerances. So risk tolerance is that acceptable level of deviation, right? That variation in performance. And management is typically going to define risk tolerances the same way they do their objectives, right? It's got to be specific. It's got to be measurable so that people understand exactly what we're getting after. So then when we say, well, how is risk tolerance measured? Well, typically in the exact same way that your objective was. So using our example, right, you might then say, well, we're going to have a risk tolerance of maybe -3%, which is to say that we're shooting for a goal, or we're hoping that we'll graduate 95% of all of our students, but we would be satisfied with a 92% graduation rate. So that's what we mean when we're defining and then risk tolerance defined. I will throw out one word of caution here, and that is the reality that risk tolerances do not apply to compliance objectives. So if the legislature comes in and says we have to do something, we can't set a risk tolerance and say, oh, well, and we'll get close. So we either comply with the law or we don't. Now, from an audit standpoint, I will say, clearly variations are going to impact maybe like audit findings, right? So for example, the law says that we need to administer the KEEP, the kindergarten entry and exit exam, right, to all kindergartners. And so if you don't do all kindergartners and you only do 95% of them, then yes, technically you're in violation of that law that says you have to administer it to all kindergartners. However, from an audit standpoint, clearly we'd much rather see an LEA attempt to do all and not get them than not attempt at all, which we just wrapped up an audit. And that's what we identified, that there are some LEAs who didn't even administer the KEEP to kindergartners. So again, just because we maybe aren't going to get the full, and we can't establish a risk tolerance, doesn't mean we shouldn't go for it. We shouldn't try, right? Once we've now defined our objectives and we've established risk tolerances, now we're in a position to actually conduct a risk assessment. And the whole purpose of the risk assessment, right, is to identify risks that impact the entity. So we're going to, as management, consider all significant interactions, right, within that entity or that party or that program or whatever, to try to identify both internal, maybe external risk factors that may prevent us from achieving our objective, right? So internal risk factors might include things like the complex nature of a program, organizational structure, new technology, things like that. External risk factors might be things like new laws. We just talked about that, where the legislature comes in and they're changing laws or amending laws or regulations, change in professional standards. That certainly applies to education. Or how about economic instability? From one year to the next, it seems like our enrollment's growing, but that doesn't necessarily mean our funding is going to grow at the same rate, right? So these are factors that we need to consider. How about natural disasters, or heaven forbid, a pandemic, right? Who would have known? But here we were just a few years ago dealing with a pandemic. So these are things we should be considering as we're trying to identify risk. So risk identification methods vary. There's a lot of ways you can do them. There's qualitative and quantitative ranking activities. There's forecasting and strategic planning. There's considerations of deficiencies, right, through audits or assessments. There's a lot of ways we can start to identify those risks. I don't think there's a set method that we have to use. Just again, we're just trying to get at, here's our objective. We've got it measured and we've set some risk tolerances. What's going to prevent us from doing that? Things we certainly should look at is like residual risk or inherent risk. Inherent risk, of course, meaning if we did nothing, what's going to happen? Residual risk is if we did something, what resides thereafter, right? So that's what residual risk is. Consider things like fraud risk or waste or abuse risk. One of the things I always like to remind people, significant change, that's a huge risk. A lot of agencies, whether they state or federal, that's something they look at all the time when they're trying to do risk-based audit programs and saying, hey, were there some significant changes within the entity? Maybe a change of a board or leadership, maybe the program changed. So change is something we should be looking at all the time. So once we've defined our objectives, established our risk tolerances, we've done our risk assessing, and we've kind of identified our risks, then we should analyze those risks. Hopefully all of you have seen what a risk matrix looks like. Typically across one axis, you have likelihood, and another one you have impact. And you're just trying to figure out, like, what is the likelihood that this is going to happen? And if it happens, what's the impact? There are some things that are like terrible. The impact's horrendous. Who could ever imagine? But the likelihood of it ever happening is very small. I would have said pandemic was in that group. up until a few years ago. And now all of a sudden we had it, and it's like, oh my goodness, it played out just like we anticipated. The impact was significant, but the likelihood was very low, but it did happen, right? So once we then analyze those and we kind of know what are our more significant risks, then we can start determining an appropriate risk response. Like, how do we want to address that risk? And so there are several risk responses that you can look at. I threw the four most common up there, except, of course, would be, we think it's insignificant. The risk is pretty minor, so we're not going to take additional action. We're going to accept whatever risk may come. Avoid. Hey, this is so problematic, we're going to stop doing this. That's not always the case, right? It's not always possible. If the legislature gives us a bill and says, hey, we need you to implement it, then it's our responsibility to do that. Now, again, you could not do that and accept the risk that comes with that, right? But typically avoid is something that maybe government entities don't have as much of an option to do. Reduce or mitigate. This is the one I think we see the most of. And that's just, we're trying to mitigate either the likelihood, right? We're trying to make it so it's not going to happen, or the impact. School shootings is something that comes to mind for me, right? Where right now there's a lot of bills going forth throughout the country that's trying to minimize the likelihood of that happening. Let's put locks on doors. Let's try to keep our environment safe, because we know the impact is so terrible. Or, of course, there's always the option of both. You try to mitigate both likelihood and impact. And then final, there's share. You can share, and that's one way that you can reduce your level of risk. That's what we did today in this presentation. I'm sharing this presentation with Samuel. In the event I didn't show up, Samuel could cover. And in the event Samuel didn't show up, I could cover, right? And so there's ways you could do it. Threw up a little cartoon there that I saw that I thought was pretty funny, right? This client likes to be impressed, so open your shoe at the very last possible second. I thought that was pretty hilarious, right? And we get to determine that level of risk. That's the thing. You can see that maybe not everyone in that plane maybe has the same idea of when they're going to pull their shoe. Some of them look like they might be pulling it earlier than others. They're less concerned with impressing this client. So anyways, so once we've now identified the risk response and we've properly analyzed that risk, we're now ready to design specific actions to take in response to those risks.
Okay, so let's say that we've chosen that we want to reduce or mitigate that risk. To do so, we're going to create a control activity. Control activity should be written down instructions that tell people exactly what they're supposed to do, which makes sense, right? I'm sure that, have you ever been hired to a position and wish there were some well-written instructions to direct you what should be done? My assumption is yes, we all have. In nearly every audit we do, we hear from staff that they wish that someone had left something down that tells them how to do the job, be it policy, procedures, or a desk manual. The wisest employees frequently tell us that although they were left nothing, they're trying to make sure that the next person in line will have those written instructions. So without control activities, we end up looking like this guy. We can sort of kind of see what we're supposed to do, right? You can see that objective over there, but the path to accomplish it isn't built yet. And sometimes, particularly when nothing's been done before, we're asked to kind of create the policies and procedures as we go. If we skip that step and immediately jump to our objective, there's a chance we'll be successful, sure. But when we move on to other jobs or roles within the organization or others, there's no guarantee that the next person faced with that same cliff will be able to make the same jump again. So again, we don't rise to those goals, we fall to the level of our systems. We performed an audit a couple years ago where we looked at program requests for reimbursement and the USB fiscal monitor who was reviewing the requests and approving the payments. While they were doing their best to follow policy, they didn't have any formal procedures, and in an attempt to be fair, they often made mistakes, such as accepting unpaid invoices and non-processed checks instead of receipts of actual money dispersed. Had they created formal policies and expectations prior to implement the program, miscommunication would have been prevented, and the audit would likely have not been requested. Ultimately, due to the errors in documentation, the program had to pay back tens of thousands of dollars. And that's why we said earlier that internal controls are about getting to the right place and getting there safely. the ACFE reported that a lack of internal controls is the primary weakness that contributes to occupational fraud. Note that controls do not bring about absolute assurance that risk will be mitigated. As we see here, the second weakness leading to fraud is an override of controls. So no matter how many controls exist, there's always the risk of collusion, which is why creating an ethical culture can really reduce an employee's ability to rationalize inappropriate behavior, and that's why it's so important. Okay, here this chart is showing the main weaknesses based on an individual's position. A lack of control is the highest for both employees and managers, but for the owner executive is actually a poor tone at the top that contributes to the most fraud. For each group, the second most common weakness is an override of existing controls. This might happen for one of two ways. First, an employee may just simply forget to review the control and instead use their own judgment to perform an action. I think it's safe to say that if employees are unaware of the policy and procedure, then perhaps no real control even exists, regardless of whether it's documented. And then second, the employee might just not understand the purpose of the control, so they ignore it. We've seen this with travel requests being approved in bulk without proper justification for each individual, where a group of employees will go to the same conference, and there's not really attention to whether the conference is relevant to the individual's responsibilities. When controls are thoughtfully put in place, however, it can ensure that limited resources are wisely used. Okay, so here's some common controls. The Green Book lists a couple categories of common controls, things like top-level reviews of actual performance, management reviews, physical control over vulnerable assets, segregation of duty, accurate and timely recording of transactions, and then obviously appropriate documentation of the transactions when they happen. So here's what ACFE has put out on most common controls in place when trying to mitigate fraud. You'll see that audit, code of conducts, management reviews, they're frequently put in place even by the regulators. They'll just write it right into the code of things that have to happen. And you'll likely see some things that you do and perhaps some things that you don't. This graph is kind of comparing whether those controls actually reduce the cost of fraud when it happens. Notice that having a hotline where people can report concerns helps reduce the cost of fraud by half. Control activities are helpful, but how do we know when to stop creating them? Simply put, when the cost outweighs the benefit. Not every control that seems like a good idea and could reduce risk might actually be worth the time and attention put into it. The same principle applies to other considerations, not just in reducing fraud. If an LEA is worried about reading scores, maybe it makes sense to invest in some new software or hire additional aides, but maybe the benefit is so small and could only increase the proficiency rate by a couple percent that maybe that effort would be best used elsewhere. Controls definitely need to be reasonable. Another example is that if it costs $1 for an accountant to process 50 cents worth of a school fee, might just be cheaper to stop charging school fees and use the save money to cover the cost of the fee instead. We saw something similar when we were doing an audit. We briefly reviewed how schools use the school land trust money. There was a wide variety of uses, and for the most part, it's up to the schools to measure their impact and determine whether the money is used successfully. So when creating those control activities, it can be a good idea to have some idea of how to measure whether that control activity is actually worth the cost it takes to implement it. Not all controls are created equal.
All right, so we've discussed one, identifying your objectives and establishing structure and tone. Right, we transition to risk where we define our objectives, our tolerances, and then analyze and try to identify what's going to prevent us from achieving our objectives. We then just transition to control activities where it's like, now what, if you've chosen to mitigate a risk or whatever, what controls are you going to put in place to do that? And Samuel, I think, covered it well that, right, there should be some sort of cost benefit analysis. I mean, I'll be honest, I think a lot of times auditors, we want controls for everything. And sometimes we don't think, oh, well, is that control out or the cost of that control outweigh the benefit? But it is something that maybe we don't necessarily verbalize a lot. Is certainly something we're always thinking of, right? Like, okay, is this control worth the effort? So those are things you certainly need to look for. Now we can transition to the fourth component of the internal control system, and that's information communication, right? So when I think of this, I think, well, we all rely on quality information to meet our objectives, right? So for example, if you have an objective to make a lot of money, that maybe you want to be rich or whatever, well, you need a reliable means to track your earnings, right? Or your cost or things of that nature, right? So you can say, am I making progress? Well, that's made through good information, right? So when we talk about information communication, what are those steps that we're talking about? Well, first, it's identifying what information you need. And if you've already gone through the parts before this, the components before this, you're probably well on your way to already knowing what information you need, right? When you establish or defined your objectives and you made sure it was specific and measurable, like our example of graduation, well, clearly we need to track who's getting credits and what credits and what percentage is graduating. And so that's all information that we know that we're going to have to start collecting, right? So again, if we're going through this process, in a lot of cases, this information component is self-explanatory. There are some cases, of course, that it may require us to devise new ways to collect information that we need that's vital to be able to see how well we're doing. So that's the reality. A lot of times the legislature says, or the board, state board says, hey, we have this new objective, this new program, and now we need you to start collecting this new data as well. In other cases, and I've seen this a lot, there may be a new program, and yet there's no clarification on what information needs to be tracked. So it's up to us, the individuals, to determine, well, what information am I going to collect so that I can justify the performance of my program, or I can explain it, right? So there is some leeway there. I always recommend to be prepared for change in government. It seems like we got a lot of change, especially around the legislative session. There seems like there's a lot of bills that are being run. So a good iterative process that is capable of responding to change is obviously something I would recommend. And just be aware, like, not only do objectives change, but so should tolerances and risk and things of that. So good change management principles are something that we want to keep in mind as we're talking about our information systems. Sometimes we get locked into contracts because it's kind of outside of our control, and we buy into systems that are not very easily modified, and that's not ideal, but unfortunately sometimes that is the reality. So the more of an iterative process, the better, right? So once we've kind of identified that information and whether or not we need to devise new ways to collect information, then it's our responsibility to start collecting that information. In a lot of cases it already exists, so we just need to obtain it. And when we talk about quality information, there's two principles that come to mind for me. One, is it relevant? And two, is it reliable? So by relevant, we're talking about, does it have a logical connection to what we're doing? Sometimes that is not very evident from the onset. I'm reminded of a global conference I attended once. We had a speaker from Egypt, and they were talking about their community. I believe they worked at a city or county level. And one of the things they were trying to measure was their happiness of their residents. And as they started to run regressions and different things and collect data, they realized that the number of potholes in the street reliably predicted the satisfaction or the happiness of the people who live in the community. And so, although it didn't seem logical to begin with, once they'd done some work, they realized this is a relevant data point to help us do it. The other piece I mentioned was reliable data. So, which means it's got to be free from errors or bias, right? So how do you count the number of potholes in the road? Are you looking from Google Earth and you're like, oh, I think that's a pothole? Or when you're driving up and down the roads, you have someone who's maybe counting potholes, and so we have pretty good data here. So it's important. Internal Audit just completed a data reliability audit of both assessment data and student data, and we found a lot of problems in data. So there was areas where it was exceptionally reliable, and there's areas where it wasn't quite as reliable. So is our data relevant? There's a logical connection, and is it reliable? So it's important to know, and I see we're running out of time, so I'm going to try to hurry up, that data is not automatically good information, right? We have a lot of data. That doesn't necessarily mean it's quality information. So we need to take that information, we need to process it, analyze it, norm it, whatever we need to do to turn that data into quality information. And then the last piece is the whole communication piece. I can't stress this enough, right? When we get this information, we need to report it out. Information should be reported up, down, across, whatever. When we do that, it mitigates the redundancies that are likely to happen if information's not known. And then one of the great ways to then ensure good communication as well is establish alternative reporting lines in the event that something is failing, whistleblower hotlines, things of that nature.
All right, last component. We'll wrap this up quick. Monitoring is different than when we talk about things like fiscal monitoring. The Green Book defines it as a dynamic process that's been adapted to continually to the risk and changes the entity faces. So internal control monitoring assesses the quality of performance over time and promptly resolves the findings of audits and other reviews. So this isn't monitoring to go out and see, is my program working, but it's monitoring to say, hey, we've designed and we've developed a control. And when we know that when we start that control, there's two parts. There's the design of it and the implementation of it. When we go back to monitor, we're looking at both of those pieces. So we'll establish a baseline and then we say, we expect that the control should be producing XYZ results. When we go back to monitor, we say, okay, we're not getting the results we're looking for. Is the design working? Yes or no? Is the implementation working as developed? Yes or no? And then sometimes we hear that a change in policies happen because of audit, and we hope that this means that the audit prompted management to go back and review its internal control framework, and because of management's review, they determined a change was needed. It's important to make sure changes happen for the right reason. Okay, so the reason for the boots. My daughter, she's 6 now. When we first bought her snow boots, she loved them. And she would wear them when it was hot and sunny outside. And then when it started snowing, and seriously, she still does this, she will go out and put on her pink sandals because she likes how they look better. And so sometimes we'll get information. We need to understand that information. If we don't understand the information and why it's necessary, we might make the wrong changes, or a good change just might not stick and we're not picking up what we should from it. So to summarize, by continuously monitoring our internal control framework, we can, we hope we can come to a better decision. And if we fail, at least we fail fast, we learn from it, and then we can quickly intervene, revise our internal control framework, and keep progressing towards our objectives.
Okay, that's all we have for you. We're happy to stick around a little bit longer if some people want to ask questions. Otherwise, we know we've used up the hour. And so thank you for inviting us, Lisa. And again, happy to answer any questions. If not, we left our information up there, and we're happy to talk internal controls with anyone at any point in time.
Thank you guys so much for being with us today. Anybody have any questions? They're a very quiet group usually.
Okay, well, see no questions. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you guys. I appreciate it very much.
Okay.
Have a good day.
All right. Bye.
All right. Just a couple of things I wanted to mention. Our next meeting is going to be February 29th, I believe. And so we have a few weeks to get ready for that. We are going to have an update from the land trust people, and that will be just a short presentation at the beginning, but it would be good if you were there to learn about the changes that are going on and how they'll affect you. And then we will have something else that I'm still trying to decide based on the time we'll have. So I do encourage you to be there. It will be good, and I'll let you know what it is before we get there. So thanks everyone for being here today. I appreciate you, and have a good month. Bye-bye.